The fluorescent lights of Morrison and Associates had been my second home for 23 years. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every temperamental copy machine, every corner where the afternoon sun hit just right through the blinds. At 61, I wasn't just the senior accountant, I was the institutional memory of the firm, the person people came to when the computers failed, and someone needed to remember how we'd handled the Baxter merger in 2003, or where the original documents for the Chen estate were filed. My name is Robert Chen, no relation to those Chens, and I'd built my career on precision, loyalty, and an old-fashioned belief that if you did good work and treated people with respect, you'd be treated the same way. My hair had gone silver, my glasses had gotten thicker, and I needed reading lights that I didn't need a decade ago. But my mind was sharp as ever, maybe sharper, because I'd seen enough creative accounting in my time to spot a red flag from across the room. That's probably what made me dangerous. According to YouTube analytics, 99% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. I first met Blake Morrison on his first day at the firm, fresh out of business school, with an MBA from somewhere prestigious that he mentioned at least 3 times in our initial conversation. He was 32, ambitious, and he'd married Vanessa Hartwell 6 months earlier. A detail everyone knew because Vanessa's father was Richard Hartwell, the real estate magnate, whose developments dotted the city skyline like steel and glass monuments to his ego. Blake had joined the family firm officially, but his father-in-law had insisted he learn the fundamentals at our accounting practice first. We all understood what that meant. Richard Hartwell had bought his son-in-law a position. The old Mr. Morrison, who'd founded the firm in 1962, had retired the year before, selling the business to Blake with Hartwell money backing the purchase. The nameplate hadn't changed, but everything else had. Robert, right? The old-timer? Blake said on the first day, extending a hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I've heard you're the encyclopedia around here. That's great. Really valuable to have that kind of historical knowledge. The way he paused before historical knowledge made my stomach tighten, but I shook his hand firmly. 23 years this November. Happy to help however I can. Fantastic. I'm sure we'll find the right place for everyone as we modernize things. Modernize. That word became Blake's mantra over the following months. New software systems, new filing protocols, new client acquisition strategies. Some of it made sense. We had been doing things the same way for a long time, but other changes felt wrong, arbitrary, designed more to assert his authority than to improve efficiency. I kept my head down and did my work. I'd survived 3 recessions, 2 major technology overhauls, and countless management shifts. I could survive Blake Morrison. What I didn't anticipate was being asked to survive my own principles. It started small. Blake asked me to review a file for one of Richard Hartwell's property developments, a mixed-use complex called Riverside Plaza. Standard due diligence, he said, just checking the numbers before the next phase of construction. I'd done hundreds of these reviews over the years, but these numbers didn't add up. The construction costs were inflated by at least 30%, according to the invoices I was seeing. Materials listed as specialty imported marble were being billed at rates that would make Michelangelo weep. But I'd seen the actual building specs. It was standard composite flooring, labor costs for specialized engineering consultations, that, as far as I could tell from the project timeline, never actually happened. The money was going somewhere, but it wasn't going into Riverside Plaza. I spent 3 nights going through every document, cross-referencing invoices with building permits, matching payment dates with delivery schedules. The more I dug, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. This was deliberate fraud. Someone was siphoning money from the development project, creating phantom expenses and pocketing the difference, millions of dollars over the past 18 months. And the approval signatures on the fake invoices? They led back to Richard Hartwell himself. My hands actually shook as I compiled my findings into a folder. This wasn't just about financial irregularity. This was about investors who'd been defrauded, contractors who might not get paid, maybe even building safety if they were cutting corners to hide the missing money. This was serious. I requested a meeting with Blake on a Friday afternoon in March. The weather outside was caught between winter and spring, gray and uncertain. I felt the same way as I sat in his glass-walled office. the folder in my lap feeling heavier than paper should feel. "Robert, what can I do for you?" Blake asked, not looking up from his computer screen. "Make it quick. I've got a golf thing with Richard in an hour." "It's about the Riverside Plaza file," I said quietly. "I've found some irregularities that I think we need to discuss." That got his attention. His eyes snapped to mine, and something cold flickered across his face. "Irregularities?" I opened the folder and walked him through what I'd found, keeping my voice level and professional, sticking to facts and figures. This was what I did. I dealt in numbers, in evidence, in things that could be proven on paper. I expected concern, maybe alarm. What I got instead was silence. Blake stared at me for a long moment after I finished. Then he closed the folder, without looking at the contents. "Robert, how old are you?" The question caught me off guard. "I'm 61, but I don't see what—" "61, he repeated, leaning back in his chair. "You know, I've been looking at our staffing structure, thinking about the future of this firm. We need energy, fresh perspectives, people who can adapt to new ways of thinking. This kind of confusion about client files, it makes me wonder if maybe the work is getting to be too much. Long hours, complex projects. It's understandable at your age." My throat tightened. "There's no confusion. The numbers are clear." "The numbers are fine, Robert. You're seeing problems that aren't there because you're used to the old systems, the old way of tracking things. These are modern development projects with modern financing structures. Maybe they're just beyond your frame of reference." "I've been an accountant for 40 years, I said, my voice harder than I intended. "I know fraud when I see it." The word hung in the air between us like a grenade. Blake's expression shifted from condescension to something dangerous. "That's a very serious accusation. The kind of accusation that could damage important client relationships. The kind of accusation that could destroy this firm." "The kind of accusation that's true," I said quietly. He stood up, and I noticed his jaw was clenched. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go home this weekend and think very carefully about whether this is the hill you want to die on. On Monday morning, we'll have another conversation about your future here. But I'll be honest with you, Robert. I've been planning to restructure anyway. We need to cut costs, bring in younger talent who can work with our new systems. The market's tight right now. For someone your age, with your outdated skill set, finding another position would be difficult." The threat was barely veiled. "Stay quiet or lose your job, and good luck finding another one at 61. I went home that weekend and told my wife, Margaret, everything. We sat at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, where we'd helped our daughter with homework 20 years ago, where we'd planned our retirement over countless Sunday morning coffees. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her hand covering mine. "I don't know if I have a choice," I admitted. "We've got the mortgage, your mother's care facility bills, Emily's wedding coming up. If I lose this job now—" "You've always said the numbers don't lie." "They don't. But apparently, the truth doesn't pay bills either." Margaret squeezed my hand. "We'll figure it out. We always do. But you have to be able to live with yourself." Monday morning came too quickly. I arrived at the office at 7:30, the same time I'd arrived for 23 years. Blake called me into his office at 8:15. "Robert, I've given this a lot of thought," he said, his tone falsely sympathetic. "I think it's time we talk about your retirement. You've had a good run here, a really impressive career, but the firm is moving in a new direction. I'm prepared to offer you 6 months severance if you're willing to sign a separation agreement today. Clean break, no fuss. We'll even throw in a nice retirement party." I looked at the papers he slid across the desk. Buried in the legal language was a non-disclosure agreement, a non-compete clause, and a liability waiver that would prevent me from ever raising concerns about any files I'd worked on. "And if I don't sign," Blake's smile vanished, "then I'll have to terminate you for cause. Performance issues, inability to adapt to new systems, concerning errors in your work. That kind of termination, there's no severance, and good luck explaining that to your next potential employer. Not that there will be many at your age. The industry's young now, Robert. Fresh blood. You're a relic. A relic. After 23 years of impeccable service, after countless nights staying late to meet deadlines, after mentoring junior accountants who are now running their own firms, after saving this company thousands of hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars with my institutional knowledge, I was a relic. "I need time to think about it," I said. "You have until end of business today. Otherwise, you're done. Clear your desk." I walked back to my cubicle on legs that felt like wood. My hands trembled as I sat down at my computer. I thought about calling a lawyer, but what would I say? I'd found evidence of fraud in confidential client files, and now I was being fired. It would be my word against Blake Morrison's and Richard Hartwell's, a nobody 61-year-old accountant versus a real estate magnate and his golden boy son-in-law. I spent that day looking at my desk. The family photos, the coffee mug Emily had given me that said, "World's Most Accurate Dad," the little potted succulent Margaret had brought in to brighten my space. 23 years condensed into a cardboard box. At 4:45 p.m., I signed the separation agreement. I took the 6-month severance, the non-disclosure agreement, and what was left of my dignity. And I walked out of Morrison and Associates for the last time. The next few months were dark. I told everyone I'd retired, which wasn't technically a lie. I updated my resume, which now seemed impossibly outdated. I applied to positions and got rejection after rejection, most of them not even bothering to send a personal note. The few interviews I did get, I could see it in their eyes. I was too old, too expensive, too set in my ways. Margaret never said I should have kept quiet, but I wondered if she thought it. Our savings were dwindling faster than I'd planned. Emily's wedding was in 6 months, and I'd promised to help with costs. My mother-in-law's care facility had just raised rates again. I felt like I was drowning in my own principles, but I also couldn't shake what I'd seen in those files. Somewhere, people had invested their money believing it was going to a legitimate development project. Somewhere, contractors were probably working with substandard materials because the budget for proper ones had been embezzled. Somewhere, the truth was buried under Richard Hartwell's polished reputation and Blake Morrison's ambition. I tried to forget about it. I really did. I focused on job hunting, on spending time with Margaret, on finally tackling the home improvement projects I'd been putting off for years. I built a pergola in our backyard, and every time I measured twice and cut once, I thought about the precision I'd brought to my work, the care I'd always taken to get things exactly right. That's when the universe decided to intervene. 6 months after I'd signed that separation agreement, I received a letter from the state attorney general's office. My hands went cold when I opened it. They were investigating Richard Hartwell for securities fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to defraud investors in multiple real estate projects, including Riverside Plaza. They had received an anonymous tip about financial irregularities, and in the course of their investigation, they'd subpoenaed records from Morrison and Associates. My name had appeared on several key documents as the reviewing accountant. They wanted me to testify before a grand jury. I sat in my kitchen holding that letter, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Margaret read it over my shoulder. "The non-disclosure agreement," I said. "If I testify, Blake will say I violated it. I could be sued, lose everything." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said, "Can they make you testify?" "It's a subpoena. I don't have a choice." "Then you don't have a choice," she said simply. "Sometimes the universe makes decisions for us." The assistant attorney general assigned to the case was a sharp woman in her 40s named Patricia Torres. We met in her office downtown, in one of those buildings with security checkpoints and metal detectors and the weight of law hanging in the air. "Mr. Chen, thank you for coming in," she said, shaking my hand. "I know this must be difficult." "I signed a non-disclosure agreement," I said immediately. "My former employer. An NDA can't be used to cover up criminal activity," Torres interrupted. "If you're subpoenaed to testify about fraud, any confidentiality agreement is void. You're legally protected." Something unknotted in my chest. I didn't know that. Most people don't. That's how men like Richard Hartwell operate. They rely on fear, on people not understanding their rights. She opened a file, and I recognized it immediately. It was my analysis of the Riverside Plaza project. The one I'd tried to show Blake, the one he dismissed as confusion from an old man who couldn't adapt. "How did you get that?" I asked. Torres smiled grimly. "Let's just say someone at Morrison and Associates wasn't as comfortable with fraud as Blake Morrison thought. It was mailed to us anonymously, but the work is clearly yours. This analysis is extraordinary, Mr. Chen. It's detailed, methodical, and it connects dots we'd been struggling to connect ourselves. Your work here opened up 3 other related investigations." I stared at the file. Someone else at the firm had known. Someone else had seen what was happening, and had found a way to get the truth out. Over the next several weeks, I met with Torres and her team multiple times. I walked them through everything I'd found, explained the discrepancies, provided context from my years of experience in development accounting. They had seized hard drives, emails, bank records, evidence of a scheme that went far beyond what I'd originally uncovered. Richard Hartwell had been running this con for years across multiple projects, bilking investors out of tens of millions of dollars, and Blake Morrison had been complicit. Maybe not initially, maybe he really had been kept in the dark at first, but by the time he'd silenced me, he'd known. The emails Torres showed me proved it. He'd known, and he'd chosen to protect his father-in-law's criminal enterprise rather than do the right thing. The grand jury indicted Richard Hartwell on 47 counts. Blake Morrison was charged as an accessory. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, it was the lead story on every local news channel. Real estate mogul charged in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. My phone started ringing, reporters wanting comments. Former colleagues from Morrison and Associates reaching out, some apologetic, some clearly fishing for information. Blake's lawyer sent a threatening letter about the NDA, which Torres handled with a single phone call that I heard ended with her saying, "Your client fired a whistleblower and participated in covering up his father-in-law's fraud. I'd be very careful about which battles you choose to fight." The trial was scheduled for 8 months later. In the meantime, my life shifted in ways I couldn't have predicted. A firm called Ethical Accounting Services reached out, a boutique practice that specialized in forensic accounting and fraud investigation. They'd seen the news coverage and were impressed with my work on the Hartwell case. Would I be interested in joining them as a senior forensic analyst? "We specifically want someone with your experience and integrity," the managing partner told me. "Age isn't a liability in our field, it's an asset. You've seen enough to know what red flags look like." I accepted the position. The salary was better than what I'd made at Morrison and Associates. The work was challenging, meaningful, and used every skill I'd honed over 4 decades. Emily's wedding went ahead as planned, and I walked my daughter down the aisle with my head high, knowing I hadn't compromised who I was to pay for it. Margaret whispered to me at the reception, "You did the right thing," and I finally believed it. The trial was a media spectacle. Richard Hartwell showed up every day in impeccable suits, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression one of wounded dignity. Blake sat beside him, looking younger than his years and desperately out of his depth. I was called to testify on the 3rd day. I walked into that courtroom, oak panels, high ceilings, the seal of the state hanging above the judge's bench, and I felt 23 years of professional integrity sitting on my shoulders. Blake's lawyer tried to tear me apart on cross-examination. Wasn't I bitter about being fired? Wasn't I too old to understand modern financing structures? Wasn't my analysis based on outdated methodologies that didn't account for contemporary real estate development practices? I answered each question calmly, precisely, the way I'd been answering questions my entire career. The numbers didn't care about my age or my feelings or my employment status. The numbers were the numbers, and they told a story of deliberate, systematic fraud. "Mr. Chen," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with condescension, "isn't it true that you were terminated from Morrison and Associates for performance issues?" "I was forced to resign," I said clearly, "after I discovered evidence of fraud in Richard Hartwell's development projects and reported it to my supervisor, Blake Morrison. I was told to keep quiet or lose my job. When I wouldn't agree to ignore what I'd found, I was given a choice between severance with a non-disclosure agreement or termination for cause. I chose severance because I had a family to support, and I was 61 years old in an industry that values youth over experience. So you admit you're disgruntled. I admit I'm an accountant who found evidence of criminal activity and was punished for it. My feelings about that don't change the facts of the fraud." The prosecutor, on redirect, asked me one final question. "Mr. Chen, in your 40 years as an accountant, have you ever encountered a case where numbers were this clearly manipulated to hide criminal activity?" "No," I said. "This wasn't sloppy bookkeeping or aggressive accounting. This was deliberate theft disguised as legitimate business expense. Mr. Hartwell knew exactly what he was doing." I stepped down from the witness stand and walked out of the courtroom. I didn't stay to watch the rest of the trial. I'd said what needed to be said. The truth was on the record now, in a place where it couldn't be buried by non-disclosure agreements or intimidation or dismissive comments about age and obsolescence. 3 weeks later, the jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for Richard Hartwell. Blake Morrison took a plea deal, reduced charges in exchange for his testimony and cooperation. He'd still lose his CPA license, still serve 2 years in a minimum security facility, still carry the conviction on his record forever. Richard Hartwell got 15 years in federal prison. His real estate empire collapsed. Investors were awarded judgments in civil suits that would take decades to settle. Riverside Plaza was sold at auction, unfinished, a monument to greed masquerading as ambition. I read about the verdict in my office at Ethical Accounting Services, surrounded by new colleagues who valued the same things I did: precision, integrity, truth. I thought about that day in Blake's office when he'd called me a relic, when he'd reduced my entire career to something disposable and outdated. He'd been wrong. I wasn't a relic. I was exactly what I'd always been: an accountant who believed that numbers told the truth, and that truth mattered more than convenience or ambition or fear. Margaret and I celebrated our 35th wedding anniversary that summer at the same restaurant where we'd gone on our first date. Over dessert, she asked me if I had any regrets. I thought about it, really thought about it. 6 months of unemployment, the fear and uncertainty, the humiliation of being fired, the stress of the trial. Against all that, I weighed the knowledge that Richard Hartwell's fraud had been exposed, that future victims had been protected, that justice, imperfect and slow as it was, had been served. No, I said finally, no regrets. Not even a few? Margaret asked with a knowing smile. Maybe I regret that it took a subpoena to make me speak up again. Maybe I should have found another way to report what I'd found, gone to the authorities directly, instead of stopping with Blake. You did what you could with what you knew at the time, and when the universe gave you a second chance, you took it? She was right. I hadn't sought revenge, I just sought employment, tried to build a new life, focused on moving forward. Karma, justice, whatever you wanted to call it, had taken care of the rest. The truth had a way of surfacing eventually, and all the money and power in the world couldn't bury it forever. A year after the trial, I received a letter from the Attorney General's office. They were establishing a whistleblower protection program and wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak at the launch event, to share my story and encourage others in similar situations to come forward. I stood on a stage in a government building, looking out at an audience of accountants, lawyers, compliance officers, and ordinary people who'd found themselves caught between doing what was right and protecting their livelihoods. I told them about the Riverside Plaza file, about the choice I'd been given, about the fear I'd felt, and the price I'd paid. But here's what I learned, I said, coming to the end of my remarks. Age isn't about how many years you've lived. It's about what you've learned in those years and whether you're willing to stand behind what you know to be true. They told me I was too old, too outdated, too stuck in my ways. What they meant was that I had enough experience to recognize fraud when I saw it, and enough integrity not to ignore it. That's not a liability. That's exactly what the world needs more of. The applause was warm, sustained. Afterward, several younger accountants came up to talk to me, to share their own stories of seeing something wrong and not knowing whether to speak up. It's scary, one young woman told me. I'm 28. I need this job. I have student loans. What if I end up like you, fired and struggling to find work? You might, I said honestly, but you might also end up like me in another way, doing work you're proud of, sleeping soundly at night, knowing you stood for something that mattered. There's no easy answer, just the answer you can live with. 2 years after my termination, Morrison & Associates closed its doors. The firm had never recovered from the scandal. Blake had tried to sell it, but who wanted to buy an accounting practice that had been complicit in a massive fraud? The younger accountants had left for other positions. The clients had fled. The office where I'd spent 23 years building my career was now leased to a tech startup. The floors polished and the walls painted, all traces of Morrison erased. I drove past it one afternoon on my way to meet a client. The building looked the same from outside, but everything inside was different. New company, new people, new purpose. It felt appropriate somehow. Transformation through truth, renewal through integrity. That night, I sat on the pergola I'd built in our backyard, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Margaret brought me a beer, and we sat together in comfortable silence. The kind of silence that comes from decades of shared life and shared values. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you just signed that separation agreement and stayed quiet? She asked. Sometimes, I admitted. Maybe I'd have found another job faster. Maybe we wouldn't have had those stressful months. Maybe I'd be retired by now, playing golf and not thinking about fraud investigations. But, but Richard Hartwell would still be stealing from people. Blake would still be helping him. Riverside Plaza would be standing on a foundation of lies. And I'd be someone I didn't recognize when I looked in the mirror. Margaret nodded. Worth it then. Worth it? I agreed. I'm 65 now. I still work as a forensic accountant, still dig through files looking for the numbers that don't add up, still believe that precision and integrity matter. My hair is whiter, my reading glasses are stronger, and my back complains if I sit too long at my desk. But my mind is as sharp as ever, and my conviction that truth matters hasn't wavered. Blake Morrison got out of prison after serving 18 months. Last I heard, he was working at a car dealership in another state. His CPA license revoked, his marriage dissolved, his father-in-law's empire dust. I don't take pleasure in his downfall. I take satisfaction in knowing that the system, slow and imperfect as it is, eventually worked. Richard Hartwell is in year 4 of his 15-year sentence. He'll be 80 when he gets out, assuming he lives that long. He lost everything: money, reputation, freedom, family. The newspapers called it a dramatic fall from grace. I call it the natural consequence of choices made over years, of prioritizing greed over integrity, of believing that power could override truth. I didn't destroy Richard Hartwell or Blake Morrison. They destroyed themselves. I just refused to help them cover it up. That's not revenge. That's not even karma, really. It's simpler than that. It's just what happens when the numbers finally speak for themselves, and someone is willing to listen. On my desk at Ethical Accounting Services, I have a new coffee mug. Emily gave it to me for my birthday last year. It says, "Old accountants never die. They just lose their balance." She thought it was funny. I did too. But the truth is, I never lost my balance. Not when I was 61 and being fired for knowing too much. Not when I was 63 and testifying against one of the most powerful men in the city. Not now at 65 doing the work I was meant to do all along. Balance isn't about staying upright when everything is easy. It's about standing firm when everything around you is trying to make you fall. It's about knowing what matters and refusing to compromise on it, even when the cost is high. I learned that in 40 years of accounting, of making sure debits equaled credits, of checking and double-checking until the numbers balance perfectly. But I learned it even better in the year I was fired for being old, and found out I was exactly the right age to stand for something true. The numbers don't lie. They never do. And neither, in the end, do the people who believe in them.